The first thing my daughter-in-law said loud enough for the entire room to hear was this: "Your Honor, my father-in-law is just a broken-down old firefighter who can't even take care of himself anymore. He has no business making decisions about anything." You could hear the ventilation system humming after that. Nobody in that courtroom moved. Nobody coughed. The family court judge, a heavy-set man with reading glasses perched low on his nose, stopped writing mid-sentence. My son Kevin sat 2 chairs down from me, looking at the floor like he wanted it to swallow him whole. And my daughter-in-law Renee, I stopped myself. No, that wasn't right. The woman who said those words wasn't Renee anymore. Not to me. I looked at her for a long second. 31 years of Sunday dinners and birthday cakes and Christmas mornings in matching pajamas. And she wouldn't even meet my eye after she said it. Then I looked at the judge. He had been reaching for his water glass when I spoke. "Elliot," I said quietly. "Elliot Marsh." The glass stopped halfway to his mouth. He squinted at me the way a man does when his brain insists he must be wrong. Then the color left his face entirely. He set the glass down carefully, stood up slowly, and for a moment, the whole room held its breath. "My God," he said quietly. "Are you Peter Calhoun?" My daughter-in-law's lawyer, a sharp-faced woman named Diane Frost, who had spent the better part of 40 minutes painting me as a confused and burdensome old man, looked from the judge to me with something approaching alarm. The confident smirk she'd been wearing since we sat down disappeared completely. The bailiff shifted uncomfortably. "Your Honor?" Elliot Marsh cleared his throat, sat back down slowly, and said in a voice that left no room for argument, "We're taking a 15-minute recess." My son finally looked up, confused. Beside him, his wife sat very still with an expression I couldn't quite read. It wasn't triumph anymore, I could tell that much. I just sat there quietly with my hands resting on the table and felt every one of my 67 years settle into my joints like lake water in November. That was the moment my daughter-in-law realized she didn't know the man she'd been trying to put away. But to explain how we ended up there, I need to go back a ways. I grew up in Sudbury, Ontario, the youngest of 4 boys in a house that smelled like engine oil and boiled cabbage. My father worked at the Inco smelter for 32 years. My mother cleaned offices downtown 3 mornings a week. We weren't poor, exactly. But we understood money as something careful, something you didn't waste. My oldest brother joined the Ontario Provincial Police. The next 2 went into the trades. I became a firefighter at 22, hired by the city of Thunder Bay after 6 months of volunteering with the Sudbury department while I saved enough for the move north. I spent 34 years on the job. Most of it I don't talk about much, not because I'm hiding anything. Just because the things you see in 34 years of Fifer and accident and flood don't fit neatly into dinner conversation. You carry them differently after a while, quietly, tucked somewhere behind your sternum where they don't rattle around too much. My wife Lorraine understood that about me. We met in Thunder Bay in 1986 at a fall fair near the marina. She'd knocked over a ring-toss bottle, trying to win a stuffed bear for her niece, and I caught it before it rolled under the booth. She laughed at herself so easily, without any embarrassment at all, and I remember thinking I'd never met anyone quite like that. We married the following spring, bought a small house near Intercity, had our son Kevin in 1990. For a long time, life was good. Not spectacular. Real good. Mortgage payments and hockey practice, and frozen pipes in January and summer weekends up at Lorraine's cousin's place near Shabandowan Lake. Kevin grew up knowing what his father did for a living, and I think it made him proud in the quiet way that boys often are about things they'd never say out loud. Lorraine died of ovarian cancer in 2016. That's the sentence I can write most easily. Living it was something else entirely. After she passed, Kevin moved me down to Toronto. He and his wife had a finished basement, spare bathroom, separate entrance. They said it made sense. I believed them. Maybe at first it did. But grief changes a person's relationship with space. I needed quiet. They needed, reasonably enough, to live their lives. His wife, I'll call her my daughter-in-law because that's what she was. Though by the time we ended up in that courtroom, the word felt strange. she'd always been polite to me. Careful. The way people are polite to furniture they're not sure they want, but haven't figured out how to remove yet. After Lorraine died, the politeness got thinner. Little things at first. Comments about how I left the television on too loud. Suggestions that I might want to keep my shoes in the basement rather than by the front door. Observations that perhaps I was seeing my son a bit too often given that he was, after all, very busy. I understood. A man in his late 60s living in your basement is not a comfortable arrangement for anyone. I tried to stay out of the way, but after a while, staying out of the way started to look, to her, like evidence of something. I became, in her version of events, isolated, confused, unable to manage my own affairs. The truth was, I missed Lorraine. The truth was, some mornings I'd sit at the little table by the basement window with my coffee going cold and just look out at the backyard for an hour without moving. That probably did look strange from the outside. From the inside, it was just grief doing what grief does. The situation came to a head over my savings. Lorraine and I had put aside money carefully over 40 years, a modest RRSP, some GICs, the pension from the fire department, and a piece of land north of the city, near Nipigon, that her father had left her and that I'd been paying the property taxes on since he died. It wasn't a fortune by any measure, but it was ours. It was something. My daughter-in-law decided, without consulting me, that I needed someone to manage these things for me. She arranged a meeting with a financial planner she knew, presented me with documents suggesting I grant power of attorney to her and Kevin jointly, and explained that this was simply the responsible thing to do given my age and my episodes. I had never had an episode. I'd had a morning or two of sitting quietly with my grief. There is a difference. I refused. That refusal, as near as I can figure, is when things shifted completely. Within 3 months, there were lawyers involved. She'd filed for guardianship, a legal designation in Ontario that would allow a court to determine that I was incapable of managing my own financial and personal affairs and appoint someone to do it for me. That someone, in her application, was herself and Kevin. Kevin didn't fight her on it. That's the part I try not to dwell on too long. So there we were. Family Court, Toronto, October. Rain streaking the windows like something out of a painting nobody wanted to hang. When Elliot Marsh came back into the courtroom after the recess, he walked more carefully than I remembered. He was older, of course. More gray. A slight stiffness in his left side that hadn't been there 20 years ago. But his eyes were the same, careful and precise. The kind of eyes that had always looked at a situation and seen more than most people wanted him to. He sat down, adjusted his glasses, and looked out across the courtroom before speaking. "I'd like a brief word with Mr. Calhoun in my chambers. Counsel is welcome to note an objection for the record." Diane Frost stood immediately. "Your Honor, I must object on the grounds of..." "Objection noted," Elliot said simply. "Mr. Calhoun, if you'll follow the clerk, please." His chambers smelled like cedar and old paper. Books everywhere stacked in a way that suggested a man who actually read them rather than arranged them for appearance. A small framed photograph on the desk. Elliot, younger, standing on the shore of what looked like Georgian Bay. A family photo. Kids who were now probably close to Kevin's age. When the door closed, he just looked at me for a moment. Then he shook his head slowly, the way men do when something surprises them that they thought nothing could. "Pete Calhoun," he said quietly. "I've thought about you more times than I can count." I didn't say anything right away. 20 years had passed between us like smoke through a window screen. "You aged well," he said finally. "You're being polite," I said. He laughed at that, short and genuine. Then he walked forward and extended his hand, and when I shook it, he gripped my forearm with his other hand the way you do when a handshake isn't quite enough. "You saved my daughter's life," he said, simply, like it was a fact the room needed to acknowledge before anything else could happen. "I did my job," I said. "Don't do that." His voice was firm, but not unkind. "Don't do that to yourself. Not in this room." I looked down at the carpet for a moment. The fire had been in August of 2003. A 3-story residential building in Thunder Bay's south end, near the Current River. Old construction, wooden frame, the kind of building that catches and moves faster than people expect. It had started on the second floor around 2 in the morning, and by the time the first units arrived, the stairwells were already compromised. Elliot Marsh had been visiting his parents for the long weekend. His daughter, 8 years old, small for her age, visiting her grandparents for the summer, had been on the third floor. I went up through a window on an aerial ladder. That's not heroism. That's the job. But the smoke on that floor was thicker than anything I'd encountered in the previous 11 years, and the structural integrity of the floor beneath me was not something I was certain about with every step. I found her in a closet with a wet towel pressed against the bottom of the door, which was either luck or an 8-year-old who had listened carefully during a school fire safety lesson. I carried her down the ladder. She weighed almost nothing. Elliot had been standing at the cordon with his parents and his wife, watching the building burn, and when I came down that ladder with his daughter, he made a sound I've never forgotten. Not a word, just a sound. He tried to talk to me afterward. I was already on to the next thing. There were other residents still being accounted for, equipment to manage, a secondary flare-up on the ground floor. By the time everything was dealt with, he'd been taken to the hospital with his daughter, and 3 weeks later I was transferred to a different station for a temporary cross-posting that turned into 2 years. We never connected. I tried to find you, Elliot said in his chambers. I contacted the department. They said you'd transferred. Things moved fast after that summer, I said. I know. I found that out. He sat down behind his desk and looked at me steadily. I kept looking, on and off for years. Your name came up in a commendation report about 5 years later, and I wrote to the department again. But by that point, you'd moved stations again. Lorraine and I moved around a few times, I said. Job postings, then her family. He nodded. I heard about your wife. I'm sorry. The room was quiet for a moment. Then Elliot leaned forward and opened his desk drawer. He removed something wrapped in a cloth, a Thunder Bay fire rescue shoulder patch, faded now, the kind that comes off a turnout coat. He set it on the desk between us. Your captain gave this to me that night, he said. Said it fell off your coat on the ladder. I've had it for 20 years. I stared at it for a long moment. He told me your name, Elliot continued. Said, that's Pete Calhoun, and if you want to thank someone, thank God he was on shift that night. I didn't trust my voice for a second. I framed it for a while, he said. Then it felt wrong, displaying it like a trophy when it belonged to you. So I kept it here. He folded the cloth back around it and set it aside. Now, he said, in a tone that shifted the room. Tell me what's actually happening with your family. So I told him. The basement. The grief. The power of attorney documents I hadn't signed. The word episodes being used to describe mornings when I sat quietly and missed my wife. The guardianship application. Kevin's silence through all of it. Elliot listened without interrupting. That's rarer than it should be in a man with authority. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then, are you confused about your finances? No. Do you understand your pension documents, your RRSP statements, your property holdings? Yes. Have you ever missed a bill, forgotten a medication, become disoriented in a way that frightened you? I thought about it honestly. No. He nodded once. That's what I thought. He looked out the window at the gray October sky. Peter, I want you to know something. What happened in that courtroom today? Your daughter-in-law's characterization of you. That's not who you are. And I suspect the people in your life know that better than she does. He was more right than he knew. Because what neither he nor I knew yet was what was waiting outside. When we walked back into the courtroom together, the room had changed. Sitting in the gallery, in 3 rows along the left side, were people I hadn't seen in years. Retired firefighters from Thunder Bay. A couple of guys I'd worked with at the intercity station. Danny Kowalczyk, who'd been my lieutenant for 6 years, and had come down from Thunder Bay on a Tuesday with no notice and presumably no small amount of inconvenience. Beside him, Gord LeBeau, who had retired 2 years before me and moved to his wife's hometown near Barrie. 2 others I recognized from volunteer work at the Veterans Transition Center in Sudbury, where I'd spent several winters helping former service members with paperwork and benefits claims. They sat quietly, no signs, no noise. Just older men in decent jackets occupying space. My daughter-in-law went rigid when she saw them. Kevin looked at the gallery for a long moment, then looked at his hands. Danny caught my eye and gave me the smallest nod. Diane Frost leaned toward her client and said something I couldn't hear. My daughter-in-law shook her head without taking her eyes off the gallery. Judge Marsh took his seat and brought the court to order, and his face was entirely neutral. But I thought I saw the corner of his mouth adjust slightly when he looked at the gallery. Proceedings resumed. Frost called an expert, a social worker who had met with me once for 45 minutes at my daughter-in-law's request, and who had submitted a report suggesting I showed signs of social withdrawal and reduced engagement with daily life. I thought about Lorraine. I thought about sitting by the basement window with cold coffee. I thought about how grief looks from the outside. Then Frost turned to me directly. Mr. Calhoun, would you agree that since your wife's passing, you've struggled to maintain normal social engagement? I've been grieving, I said. Those aren't the same thing. But you've spent significant time alone, correct? You've declined family invitations? I've needed quiet, I said. That's not the same as being incapable. She shifted papers. Your son has expressed concern about your ability to manage your financial affairs going forward. You have significant assets. I have a pension, some savings, and a piece of land in Nipigon that my wife's father left her, I said. I know what those are worth. I know what my property taxes are. I know what my GIC maturity dates are. I know my monthly budget within a few dollars. The courtroom was very quiet. Frost tried a different angle. Isn't it true that you refused to engage with a financial professional your family arranged specifically to assist you? I refuse to sign documents giving someone else control of my finances, I said. I'm 67 years old, not 6. Something shifted in the gallery, not audible, just a settling, like men straightening in their seats. Frost glanced at the gallery and then back at me. She was recalibrating. Then something happened that nobody expected, least of all me. Kevin spoke. Your Honor, he said. His voice was unsteady but clear. I'd like to say something. Frost turned to him immediately. Kevin, I'd like to say something, he repeated. Judge Marsh looked at him for a moment. You may speak. Kevin didn't look at his wife. He looked at his hands, then at me, then at the judge. I don't think my father needs a guardian, he said. I think he needed his family to sit with him after my mother died, and instead we gave him a basement and a separate entrance and told him to stay out of the way. His voice cracked slightly on the last few words. That's not the same as incapacity. I know the difference, and I should have said so a long time ago. The silence that followed was complete. My daughter-in-law sat very still. I looked at my son for a long moment. He was 43 years old. He had his mother's jaw and his father's stubbornness, and I'd spent 43 years being more proud of him than I'd ever known how to say out loud. Marsh adjourned for the day shortly after. The application would be revisited the following morning, he said, with several additional considerations he wished to review overnight. Outside, rain had softened to a drizzle, the kind of October afternoon in Toronto where the light goes gray and flat and everything smells like wet concrete and coffee from somewhere nearby. I was standing on the courthouse steps when Kevin came out behind me. We didn't say anything for a minute. I'm sorry, Dad, he said finally. I looked out at the street. A streetcar went by. A woman pushed a stroller under an umbrella. She was worried about me, I said. I think she meant well at the start. That doesn't make it right. No, I agreed, it doesn't. Another pause. You should have seen your face when that judge stood up, Kevin said quietly. What happened there? What's the connection? Old fire call, I said. 20 years ago, the judge's daughter? I nodded. Kevin was quiet for a moment. Mom knew about that one, didn't she? You told her. Once, I said. Late one night, few years after. He looked at the wet sidewalk. She never told me. Some things are private, I said gently. Kevin wiped his face with the back of his hand in the way men do when they're not quite ready to call what's happening crying. Why didn't you ever? Dad, you carry everything by yourself. Every single thing. I thought about that. 34 years of things you don't bring to the dinner table. The particular silence of men who spent their working lives in situations where falling apart wasn't an option. The way that silence becomes a habit so deep you can't find the door out of it anymore. Men from my generation weren't taught how to set it down, I said. I know that's not an excuse. Kevin leaned against the railing. You sold the property near Nipigon, he said quietly. I saw it in the financial documents. The lawyer mentioned it. You sold it 4 years ago. I hadn't told him that. The land was Mum's, I said. After she passed, it didn't feel right just to keep it sitting there. You donated the money, Kevin said. It wasn't a question. He'd seen something in the documents. To the Cancer Foundation. I donated most of it. Yes, Dad. His voice broke a little on that one syllable. Your mother would have done the same, I said. She just didn't have the chance. The drizzle picked up slightly. Down the steps, Danny Kowalczyk and Gord LeBeau were waiting near the street, not wanting to interrupt, decent enough to hang back. Kevin saw them. Those men came down here for you. I know. Danny drove from Thunder Bay. I know. Why would they do that? I watched Danny say something to Gord, who laughed at whatever it was. Two old men in the rain outside a Toronto courthouse, not particularly troubled by the fact that nobody was watching. Because that's what you do, I said. When someone shows up for you over the years, you show up for them. You don't keep score, you just show up. Kevin looked at me for a long moment. I should have shown up for you. There was nothing much to say to that. So I just put my hand on his shoulder, briefly, the way my father used to do, and we stood there together watching the rain. The following morning, Judge Marsh dismissed the guardianship application. Not dramatically, quietly, thoroughly, with detailed written reasons that, the clerk told me afterward, ran to 11 pages. He found no evidence of cognitive impairment, no credible basis for limiting my legal capacity, and noted that the proceedings appeared to have been initiated without sufficient consultation with the individual whose capacity was in question, meaning me. He also wrote something that Kevin read to me later from a printed copy he'd gotten from the courthouse, sitting at my kitchen table with 2 cups of coffee going cold between us. The capacity to live quietly, to grieve, to prefer solitude over social performance, does not constitute incapacity. These are human conditions, not diagnostic ones. The court finds no basis for intervention in Mr. Calhoun's affairs. I moved out of the basement the following month. I found a 1-bedroom apartment in a low-rise building in the east end of the city, close enough to Kevin that Sunday dinners were possible, far enough that I had my own walls. The apartment had large windows and a small balcony overlooking a park, and on clear mornings I could see a slice of the lake between 2 buildings if I stood at exactly the right angle. I slept better there than I had in 4 years. Something about the quiet belonging to me again. In January, I started volunteering at a seniors legal clinic in the neighborhood, a drop-in service run by law students where older people who couldn't afford lawyers could get basic guidance on things like tenant rights, pension disputes, and, occasionally, capacity assessments and guardianship applications. I handled reception, mostly, made coffee, helped people fill out forms, sat with them when the waiting got long. I was good at sitting with people. I'd had practice. One afternoon in February, I looked up, and Elliot Marsh was standing in the doorway in a civilian jacket with his hands in his pockets. I heard you were here, he said. How? Danny Kowalczyk. He's a talker. I laughed at that. Sit down. Coffee's terrible. He sat down and we drank bad coffee and talked for almost 2 hours. About his daughter, who was now 28 and working as a nurse in Vancouver. About Lorraine, who Elliot had read about in the department pension records when he was trying to find me. About his own marriage, which had ended quietly a decade earlier. About the particular loneliness of men who had done important work and then retired and discovered that the world had simply moved on without much ceremony. What do you do with that? He asked at one point. With the feeling that it didn't matter as much as you thought it did. I thought about that. Seriously. You find smaller things, I said. You find the person sitting next to you who needs someone to sit next to them, and you do that instead. Elliot looked at the intake forms stacked on the table between us. Is that what this is? Pretty much, I said. He was quiet for a moment. My daughter asks about you sometimes. She was 8 when it happened. She doesn't remember details, but she knows. She knows there was someone on a ladder. He paused. I told her your name last year. I didn't say anything. She said she'd like to write to you, if you'd be willing. I thought about that. An 8-year-old in a closet with a wet towel. A woman now, 28 years old, working as a nurse somewhere on the West Coast. All that life between those two moments. I'd be glad to hear from her, I said. Kevin came for dinner that Sunday. His wife didn't come. He didn't come. Things between them were complicated in ways that would take time to sort, if they sorted at all. But Kevin came, and he brought his daughter, who was 6 years old and had her grandmother's exact laugh, which still stopped me every time I heard it. Her name was Clara. After dinner, she helped me wash up and told me at length about a project she was doing at school, about animals that hibernate. Did you know, she said very seriously, standing on a step stool to reach the sink, that groundhogs can slow their heart down to only 5 beats per minute? I did not know that, I said. It's so they don't die, she explained. They just go very still and wait for it to get warmer. I thought about the basement. The cold coffee, the window, the gray winter light. That's pretty smart, I said. Grandpa, she said. Were you a hero? Dad says you helped save someone. I handed her a dish to dry. Your dad's being generous, Ace? But you went into fires? That was my job. But you weren't scared? I looked at her. Lorraine's laugh, her father's jawline, 6 years old and entirely certain the answer to this question mattered. I was scared plenty, I said. The job was just bigger than the scared. She considered this with the focused seriousness of a child who takes information seriously. I think that's what brave is, she said finally. Yeah, I said. I think maybe you're right. After she and Kevin left, I stood on the balcony in the cold for a while. The park below was empty. A few lights on in the apartments across the way. The city doing what cities do, moving, humming, carrying on. I thought about Lorraine. About 30 years of Friday night soup, and the particular way she folded a newspaper, and the sound of her voice in the morning, before she'd fully woken up. About how grief doesn't end so much as it changes shape. How after a while you stop trying to put it somewhere and just let it come with you. A few weeks later, a letter arrived from Vancouver. 1 page, handwritten, slightly formal, in the way of someone who wants to get something right. She said she was glad I was well. She said her father had told her about the October in Toronto. She said she'd grown up, knowing, without quite knowing how she knew, that someone had been on a ladder in the dark for her sake, and that knowledge had always felt like something she owed a debt toward, though she'd never been sure how to pay it. She said she'd become a nurse because of it, because of one night when she was 8 years old, when a stranger had come through smoke to find her and carry her down. I read it twice, and then set it on the table by the window where the morning light came in. Outside, it was March now. Still cold, but a different kind of cold. The kind that has some give in it. The kind that knows it can't last much longer. I made coffee, put on the radio, listened to the morning news while the city came awake around me. And somewhere across the park, I could see the first uncertain green at the tips of the trees. Some things, I've learned, don't come back the same way they left. But some things come back, and when you've spent enough years watching for them, you get pretty good at recognizing them when they do.